Welcome all to this session on technology, law, technology, and climate change, hoping that technology will help us solve the big issues that we've been discussing for the last 2 days. So this session is aimed at exploring the role of law in supporting the development of innovation and technology, the way in which we want to look at the role of regulation in facilitating, incentivizing, or actually slowing down innovation that we all are hoping for. And certainly, I think the way in which we need to continue to invest in thinking about the role of innovation and the interplay between law and innovation. So that's the theme of our session. I'm delighted that we are having with us fabulous speakers with us today. I'll briefly, I think the format is they're all going to speak for 5-10 minutes. Some will address you from the podiums, other from the chair. We have a couple of questions to discuss together, and I'm looking forward to listening and reading your questions as well and putting them to our panel. So thank you very much for being here. Let's start with Professor Alarie. Ben is well known, I think, in the law school. He is obviously the professor and the Osler Chair of Business Law, expert in tax, regulatory, and has been doing a lot of work on technology as well. So, and he was a junior fellow at Massey College. So I just wanted to mention that in passing. So Ben, maybe we here too.
Okay. So I take as my starting point that addressing climate change is a wickedly difficult problem. And I believe when you encounter a wickedly difficult problem, you're going to make the most progress by getting as clear as possible as you can on the exact nature of that wickedly difficult problem. And for me, that calls to mind something that's attributed to Abraham Lincoln, which apparently he said, if I'm given an axe and 6 hours to cut down a tree, I'll spend the first 4 hours sharpening the axe, which is, let's get really, really clear on what is this wickedly challenging problem of climate change, because I've been at the conference, yesterday, today, and there are so many challenges and so many amorphous challenges, and we need to really pin down what are the challenges. And this also brings to mind the excellent quote from Bertrand Russell that Andrew Green cites at the start of his book, Picking Up the Slack. I highly recommend this book. I see you, Dan Quinlan. You're appreciating the plug for Andrew's book too. You should all buy this book, Picking Up the Slack by Andrew Green. This is the quote that Andrew picks from Bertrand Russell to start the book. When you are studying any matter or considering any philosophy, ask yourself only, what are the facts and what is the truth that the facts bear out? Never let yourself be diverted either by what you wish to believe or by what you think would have beneficent social effects if it were believed, but look only and solely at what are the facts. And so to get at the facts, I think we have to ask some questions. And so, like Abraham Lincoln, I would want to begin with sharpening my axe by asking and getting to the facts as best as I can. And so for me, as I approach this wickedly difficult problem of climate change, I think about 3 different categories of questions. The first category are scientific and technological. I know there's been enormous energy put into investigating these questions. I'll raise a few of them. The second category are regulatory and institutional questions. We've heard a little bit about that so far. And then I think there are a third set of questions around power, politics, and diplomacy. So let's start with the scientific and technological questions. So what precisely are the threats to life of all kinds from climate change? How do we define these threats? What precisely are the issues we're called on to address? based on what we know today, what do the distribution of future possible paths for us look like? Like really, I know there's been a ton of work on this, but we need to really try to reach as best we can consensus on what the risks really are. And then we need to ask questions about what are the causal mechanisms, what are the scientifically um, driven mechanisms that are leading us to this climate change challenge. And then given our current understanding, what can be done as a matter of science and technology to address those causal mechanisms that are actually driving the overall challenge. And so I know that there's been a ton of work on this. I'll have a few words to say about nuclear fusion. I know it came up yesterday in some of the conversations. I think there's progress to be made there. On the regulatory and institutional questions, what arrangements will provide incentives for developing and deploying the right technology at scale? If we need to put a dent in the climate change problem, what are those mechanisms? How do we support and shape the incentives of governments and or businesses to provide the right kinds of solutions? How do we help support the proper functioning of market mechanisms? Importantly, how do we address potential market failures or opportunistic behavior by parties in the system? So how do we prevent market manipulation? How do we help to support market responsiveness to the climate crisis? Importantly, and I was chatting with Anthony about this before the panel, how can we pre-commit to allowing legacy technologies, projects, approaches to fail? How do we actually commit to letting really powerful interests fail? And we need to prepare ourselves for the challenge, the rearguard actions that legacy technologies are going to pose for our institutions. Equally, and perhaps surprisingly, maybe to some people, how do we pre-commit to allowing big bets to pay off where investors in bold new technologies actually have made excellent choices and supported winning technologies, because there'll be a lot of pressure to expropriate the fruits of big bets that do pay off in the interest of climate emergency. Oh, we need to expropriate. Maybe, maybe not. And if we can't pre-commit to allowing the winners to win, that's going to blunt the incentives for innovation now. And then politics and power. This is the third category of questions. What are the social, political, ecological, economic interests at play that are likely to interfere or frustrate efforts to address climate change? Who are the most likely losers from climate change? I guess aside from all of us. What measures are prudent or wise to address resistance by losers? And who has the jurisdiction to decide what to do? Who governs? So a lot of these questions have been addressed so far in the last couple of days. I think you can boil it down to one big question, though, which is this. What can be done with the available resources that we have, the capital, materials, our scientific understanding, the political will that we have, the legal institutions we have in the available time? And again, this gets back to that first question. What do the future paths look like? What are the likely futures from where we are now? I earlier suggested that I'd say something about nuclear fusion, and I think I'm going to, because I've done a little bit of reading on this, and it's really encouraging. It's really hard to know how real a lot of this is, but there are at least 25 companies, really well-financed companies, that have been making progress on this front. The leading company is a company apparently. I say apparently, they're the leaders, Commonwealth Fusion. They're building a facility an hour west of Boston. It's a startup that's spun out of MIT, and they've raised $2 billion, close to $2 billion of investment. And they've announced some breakthrough technologies. They're building a facility. They expect to have a feasible nuclear fusion reactor operating as early as 2025. There are a bunch of other privately backed nuclear fusion companies. Commonwealth is backed by Bill Gates' Breakthrough Energy Fund, and so really powerful backers there. There are others, mostly American, one Canadian, General Fusion out of Vancouver, Helion, General Atomics, TAE Energy based out of California, Tokamak Energy, Zap Energy, First Light Fusion, and so on, that that have each raised tens of millions. Some of them have raised hundreds of millions of dollars of capital investment. So these are private firms working away on nuclear fusion. And then there's a leading public consortium based in France, ITER, which is a collaboration among 35 countries aiming to build a fusion tokamak in France. It's expected to go online by the end of 2035, but it's by far the most well-financed of any effort. There's over $30 billion of investment in that effort. And so there's a lot of money, a lot of investment, a lot of talent going to nuclear fusion research. And one of the things that came up this morning was this idea of fragmentation, and we should really concentrate all of our bets. I don't necessarily have that same intuition. I think we benefit from having a proliferation of bets. Let's have a bunch of bets. Let's have a portfolio of bets, each of which may seem like it has a long shot of succeeding. But if, this is straight up portfolio theory, you want to have a bunch of bets, and if one pays off spectacularly, then we should build on that success. And I like the idea of having a bunch of different bets backed appropriately. So in the paper, and I'm just going to talk quickly about this, in the paper, I start with the observation that environmental regulation for a long time was very much about command and control. And that makes sense when you think about where environmental regulation came from. There were known negative externalities you want to address. There were clear things you wanted to reduce: contaminants X and Y in the environment, often very local, very regional influences, and there were known technologies for abatement of those contaminants. And so you could just directly prohibit or limit certain kind of pollutants entering into the environment. There's a lot of benefit in having market-based incentives to govern greenhouse gas emissions, so cap and trade, carbon tax, lots of arguments to be made in favor of that. But thinking about nuclear fusion, it's interesting because we're going to be faced with the question about how do we allow the losers to lose? So how do we allow the market to work with respect to losing technologies? But then how do we allow the winners to really win from the breakthrough technologies that may be developed? But then that's all in the backdrop of having to act urgently and get to scale and execution and distribution of this technology as quickly as possible. And that may happen through private incentives, but it may, after all, actually require command and control, a mandate to push nuclear fusion as quickly as possible if one of these efforts, one or more of these efforts are successful. One of the reasons why, as a layperson in this area who's not an expert on the science, that I get very excited about the possibility of nuclear fusion is the technology is such that apparently a small nuclear fusion power plant will sit on a much smaller footprint than most conventional power plants today. And you could pretty much swap them out, decommission an existing power plant, put in a new nuclear fusion power plant, connect it to the grid, and the amount of radiation coming out of the facility would be less than is associated with the radiation in a dentist's office with the X-ray machine, which is amazing. I mean, if that can play out, that would be really a terrific innovation. And then it becomes, okay, how do we get that to scale? How do we provide the market incentives? How do we have the right institutional support for that at scale? And so I think that's something that I'm very excited about. And maybe I'll close with this observation, which is I'm really an optimist about technology. I really admire human ingenuity. I think humans are, we're very intelligent apes, and we're very good at muddling through and figuring things out, but capturing things that one or more of us figure out and then copying it at scale. And I think if we have enough of us operating on these problems, and I think we do, we stand to make really good progress. And I really am optimistic about our ability to combat climate change and copy what the best of us are doing. I'll close with that.
It's rare that you have optimist when we're talking about climate change. So this is a good way to start an afternoon, a Friday afternoon. So now let's hear from Professor Niblett, who is the Canada Research Chair in Law, Economics, and Innovation, going to talk a little bit about market failure and the free rider problem.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Super. Well, thank you very, is this loud enough? This is, yeah, okay. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you very much for inviting me to, I think this is an incredibly interesting and just so important conference. So congrats to you, to Brenda, Andrew, Ben for putting this on. My name is Anthony. I am a law professor here. I'm a chair in law, economics, and innovation. And I have to say, being a law professor is probably the best job in the world, but it can be extremely depressing at times because we spend most of our time thinking about things like conflict and harm and victims and blame and injury and damage. And much of this conference has been about failure. And I've been on a lot of conferences over the last 7 years talking about law, innovation, and technology. And without fail, I am usually the most optimistic person on the panel. Maybe not today. I don't know. No, I still think I will be. We are here to focus on the role of law and its impact on technology. And when you talk to law professors, most law professors come at it from a very particular angle, which is let's focus on the risks. Let's focus on the ethics of this new technology. Let's focus on the morality of this new technology. Let's think about whether we should be banning this technology or the guardrails of this technology, all of which is extraordinarily important. It's just that I come at it from a very, very different place because I think that, like Ben, I think that technology has the power to make all of our lives better. It has enormous power to make our lives better. I'm extremely optimistic when it comes to the ability of technology to solve problems. I don't think that they're technological problems. I think they're human problems for the most part. And now I'm being asked to speak for the very first time about climate change. It is not something I'm an expert on by any stretch of the most elastic of imaginations. I am no expert on engineering or the science of climate change, but I think it's helpful just to get a bit of a background about how we got here and the kinds of technologies that we had that led us here to this climate change problem. Because the world has changed incredibly in the last 100, 120 years, just incredibly. I'm going to put up a number. Or maybe not. Hang on, let's see if we 73. 73 is my number. 73 is the average life expectancy of people on Earth, everywhere on Earth. Everywhere on Earth, 73 is the average life expectancy on Earth. Rewind back 122 years. What is the average life expectancy on Earth? 31. What happened in that last 122 years? Average life expectancy 1931 across the world. Something happened. Something happened, something incredible happened in the last century that changed our lives. The good old days, probably not that good. Not just the last 120 years, last 40 years, things have changed enormously. I'm going to put up a number that is, I think, is unimaginably large for most people. 3 million. 3 million is the number of people who escape extreme poverty every month. And that has happened every month on average for the past 40 years. 1.5 billion people have left poverty, extreme poverty in the last 40 years or so. Just gonna put up this. This is my favorite picture on the internet. This is my favorite picture on the internet because it shows, yes, more and more people in the world, but the number of people living in extreme poverty across the world has reduced by over 1.5 billion people. Something incredible has happened over the last 40 years. Why is it that we're living longer? Why is it that we're living better? Well, things like food, food security. We have this amazing ability to produce food that we just didn't have 100 years ago. What we did in the 20th century was we basically eradicated famine. Not entirely, but basically eradicated famine. You go back in history, it is not uncommon for one bad harvest to wipe out 5% of the population. India, 1876, 7% of the population died. Ireland, 1850 or so, more than 10% of the population dies. Just terrible, terrible way of living. We have improved food security, the Green Revolution, Haber-Bosch. Without these innovations to produce food, these ways in which we produce food, the world could not support, in terms of food, more than 4 billion people. That's billions of lives as a result of technology. Access to water, the number of people across the world who didn't have access to water compared to today, just incredible changes in the way we've got access to clean drinking water, sanitation, infant mortality. I mean, there's a statistic that I think 200 years ago in the richest countries in the world, Britain, France, Germany, United States, 200 years ago, 1 out of every 3 children under the age of 5 didn't make it to the age of 5. 1 out of every 3 did not make it to the age of 5, which I find shocking. Nowadays, the number is about 1 in 300. In some countries, it's like closer to 1 in 800. Even in the very poorest countries in the world, right now, it's 1 in 30. Things have changed. Vaccines have saved billions of lives. We've got more access to electricity that has enabled this world. We've got more access to information, which has enabled this world. How do we get these things? How do we get these benefits? What gave us all these good things? What saved the lives of billions of people? Innovation. But it doesn't just come out of thin air. It's not just like we just, we can just eradicate disease or eradicate famine or create vaccines. Innovation doesn't come out of blind optimism. Ben is optimistic. I am optimistic. We both have enormous hope, but it's not blind. It's not just like tomorrow something's going to happen. Something else, something else has happened. If humans were altruistic and were able just to think, oh, we just need to innovate, we probably wouldn't have as much conflict in the world, and we probably wouldn't need as much law. We probably wouldn't need a law school. So we do need something else. We've learned a lot about what incentivizes people, what motivates innovation, how do we create innovation? And importantly, we need law. We need law. And I'm going to use law in an extremely broad sense. Law can crush innovation. You can put too many guardrails on innovation. You can ban the use of technologies. Law can also spur technology. It can also spur innovation. And when we talk about innovation law, we commonly think about things like patents, when we think about awarding property rights, because we know that if you just leave it to a market to act by itself, we won't get enough. We will not get enough innovation if you just leave things to the market, because knowledge is a public good. Soon as it's out there for everybody. And so people say to themselves, why should I invest the next few years of my life coming up with knowledge if that knowledge is going to be freely available to everybody else? If I can't reap the rewards of that knowledge, I'm not going to spend the next 10 years researching this. Someone else will pay. Someone else can pay for it. And ultimately, if someone else can pay, nobody ends up paying. And this is the ultimate free rider problem. And so patents can help align the incentives of society with those of private innovators. And without aligning these incentives, we would not have had all these wonderful things. We would not have had all these wonderful things, but it came at a cost. There's a trade-off. What is that trade-off? These good things don't just come for free. And one of those costs is the climate. And one of these awful side effects that comes out of creating electricity in the way that we have decided to create it is that we have the problems that have emerged from the greenhouse gases, etc. And people are dying. People are now dying. I heard a statistic on the radio this morning, 5 million people per year. Lots of people are suffering as a result. You know, some of my colleagues don't think about these things in terms of trade-offs, but I think this is how we should be thinking about this. There's our trade-offs in the quality of life. Can we use the same tools that we use to solve these problems? Can we use those same tools to solve the problems of climate change? To what degree can we rely on the same tools? And that's where I'm a little less optimistic. The Australian government came out a couple of years ago and said, with their climate change policy, and one of their solutions was, we're going to reduce net emissions of carbon, and 20% of it will come out of technology that hasn't been invented yet, but didn't have any solution for how to innovate it. This idea that this technology is just going to come out of thin air. Someone's going to solve it. Someone else will pay. And that's the kind of the problem. This free rider problem is kind of everywhere. The kind of solutions that I think we need are not going to be solved with patents. They're not going to be solved with property rights. The solutions that we have to food production, medicine, vaccines, they are not likely to solve some of the bigger problems when it comes to climate change, because the benefits that emerge from these sorts of innovations are so diffuse that nobody wants to pay. Someone else is going to pay. It's the ultimate free rider problem. I'm not a scientist. I'm not an engineer, but from what I understand, mitigation is not enough. Switching to solar, wind, nuclear is not happening fast enough. Even if we do switch, are we really actually solving the problem, or are we just, there are lots of good things about having a good carbon tax, but are we actually going to be solving those problems? Won't reduce the temperature, won't replenish the reefs, it won't put ice back on the poles. It's just going to slow things down. And there is amazing work being done by people who are trying to do these geoengineering efforts, trying to think about ways of literally turning down the temperature. Things like direct air capture. I kind of got sucked into Bill Gates' book quite a lot, and this idea of actually perhaps there's ways to actually reduce carbon in the air. Now, it turns out it's an incredibly difficult problem because carbon is so diffuse in the air. A very small portion of the air is actually carbon dioxide. But there are companies and there are researchers around the world engaged in this right now. There's a company in Iceland that's doing this. Very costly at the moment. The fact that it's costly at the moment, though, is not a reason to stop doing it. A lot of technologies were costly 10 years ago and become cheaper over time. Solar is a classic example of this. You go back to the debates when Barack Obama was talking about this, lots of people saying solar is just too expensive. Sulfates in the atmosphere. Turns out when there's a volcano, volcano exposure, temperatures around the world tend to drop. And there are scientists saying, well, maybe we can try and replicate some of this. Maybe we can put sulfates in the atmosphere to try and replicate without the catastrophic consequences that happen when sometimes we have volcanic explosions. Things like cloud brightening. If I've run out of time, Natalie. No.
2 more minutes? 2
more minutes. All right, I'll make that 5. Okay. Cloud brightening. Look, maybe the solution hasn't been solved, isn't it? I don't know. I just don't know. All I know is that the current system of innovation law is unlikely to help. If you just rely on patents and property rights, the benefits are just far too diffuse. Who's going to pay when it's the solution where the benefits are being felt by 8 billion people? Who's willing to pay for that? Nobody is going to be willing to invest in it unless you do something else. And one thing I actually was hoping to talk about before I started talking about how wonderful technology is, was the importance of using government prizes and government grants. That's where the energy needs to be. The idea that we don't award a property right. What we do is we just say, here's the problem. Here's a large amount of money to solve this problem, this particular problem. Then the idea gets put out into the public domain. You don't get the problems that you get with patents, and you still get that innovative incentive. When do they work well? They work well when we know what the problem is and we know what the value is of that of solving that problem. And it works well when we know what the cost of solving that problem is. This is something that's been done before. I can rattle off a number of examples of prizes being used to solve problems. Grants, similarly, we should be encouraging more and more research grants into solving these sorts of problems. In some sense, it's really just a different way of thinking about prizes. Essentially, these are prizes for past work and potential. And in earlier talks today, there was mention of, or some of the concerns about patchworks. This idea that, oh, it's kind of concerning that lots of people are working on lots of different problems. I'm like, Ben, I think that's a great thing. We should be solving trying to solve lots of different problems. And if we fail, so be it. Let's if particular projects fail, I think we should have a whole patchwork of different grants and different prizes. But the way in which law has created these benefits is unlikely to solve the climate change problem. Laws are human-made. They are jurisdiction-based. Climate change does not know what jurisdiction is. So one government puts forward a prize, everybody is going to benefit. That free rider problem is still going to be there. We need some sort of international solution rather than just individual countries, because otherwise everybody's going to act like Australia and just say somebody else will do it. Somebody else will invent that 15, 20%. And even though I am the most optimistic law professor, there are still, I am not blind optimistic. I'm not a blind optimistic. I am hopeful, but I understand that there are new problems that will have to be solved. And hopefully in 100 years' time, there will be another conference on some other topic. And someone like me will stand up and say, remember in the 20th century how we solved famine? And then remember in the 21st century how we solved climate change. And so I'm very optimistic, and lawyers are going to play an absolutely pivotal role in getting us there. All right, thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. And now to have the AI regulatory system, we have Professor Gillian Hatfield. She's the Schwartz-Reisman Chair in Technology and Society, Professor of Law, Professor of Strategic Management. She is the Director of the Schwartz-Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. Also, she's the AI Chair for the Vector Institute of Artificial Intelligence with CFAR, and also Senior Policy Advisor at OpenAI. Nice to have you with us, Gillian. Take us away.
Thanks, Natalie. And wow, I get to back clean up at the end of all of this, and lots of optimism and lots of great discussions in the last 2 days. Kim Stanley Robinson started us off with the idea that language is a technology. So given that we are the technology panel, I want to make that really clear, that we are not talking about technology as a thing out there. We're doing something different. Law is a technology. And I wrote a book. I actually had those stats in there about, what we've accomplished in the last 100, 150 years. And I do think that law has played a fundamental role in that. Law created the platform, provided the infrastructure for those advances. But my concern about where we are in terms of law and law and regulation, I just throw it all in the same pot. The rules that we use for organizing our complex societies, phenomenally complex societies. I've been worrying about how well our technology is working for a few decades now, maybe even 3 decades. You can hear, am I okay? Am I good? Okay, all right. And that's where I kind of want to turn the mirror back on us, because what we tend to do when we say, what can law do about a problem? I've thought about access to justice. I think a lot about the AI transformation that's upon us. I, like many of us have said, haven't been thinking a lot about climate as from an academic perspective. But when I look out at the state of our our legal and regulatory infrastructure, what I see is that we invented something phenomenal. I think it did provide the platform that that Anthony is referring to for the advances that we've experienced. And sorry, my slide just disappeared from here. But we continue to use the same tools for a problem that has just fundamentally shifted. Maybe we need to put the axe down and stop cutting down the trees, or look to our different technologies. So I've been thinking a lot about how do we innovate fundamentally law and regulatory technology itself. What's our current technology? Our current technology is, and we've talked a lot about this, we have different standard institutions, we have executives, we have courts, we have lawyers, we regulate those lawyers in a particular way. We decide who can provide those services, and we write a lot of words down. We hand them to lawyers, we interpret them, we argue about them, we take them to courts, we get decisions that produce a lot of words. So one of the things that I did to prepare for this, not knowing anything about sort of the fundamentals of regulation with respect to relevant to climate change, I went and said, okay, what does regulation look like here? I wasn't even sure what to look for, by the way. That's how little I know. But I go, okay, so I noodle around a little while, and the EPA just published final rules in January of this year for the control of emissions from all different kinds of vehicles. There's a separate rule for the control of emissions from heavy duty vehicles, not all emissions. These are NOxes, nitric oxides, and somebody else will fill me in. There's two kinds, whatever. And they're not greenhouse gases themselves, but they contribute to greenhouse gases because they produce ozone. I do this amount of research to talk to you today. Anybody knows any more about that, please correct me. So I looked up what is the final rule. And I don't know how many of you spend your time looking at things like the Federal Register, but that's what's on my screen here, right? It's 450 pages. It's filled with some bunch of numbers, and it even have math. Look at this, math and graphs in it. And why does it have that? Because it's setting standards, but then it has to set all kinds of techniques and standards for monitoring and saying, well, you know, and if the car is operating or the truck is operating and the emissions are different and the environment is different and all the input they get is about adjusting those. It's a very, very complicated approach to regulation. The goal is pretty clear. It's to reduce emissions, but the path there is very complex, and our existing regulatory technology for this is to convert it into a bunch of words, which, believe me, people will be arguing about for a long. There'll be litigation, there'll be enforcement actions, we have invented a phenomenally expensive system. Partly what my comment before lunch is, and this is sort of the work that I've been thinking about for a long time, is we create and we argue about and we design, and you know, it's beautiful, right? The things that we do and talk about how we define rights, how we define the relationship between government, our theories of politics, our theories of constitutions, and so on. But at the end of the day, how much of that actually ends up changing things on the ground? How much does it really change what's happening on the ground? I don't think we take enough responsibility for that as lawyers. So, Abdi, my comment about legal ethics is I think this is our fundamental duty as lawyers, because we design this system, we execute this system, and we assume the authority to decide how the system will be designed and implemented. So I don't think it's actually on us to be able to say, just take for granted that the system works like this, because we are the ones who invented that. So part of thinking about how we will respond to massive challenges, like if it's a crisis and everybody tells me it's a crisis, right? We're not behaving like it's a crisis. We're behaving like we will continue to have multi-year litigation and arguments and write papers. We are not behaving like it's a crisis, like, oh my God, we need a different tool. That axe is not going to work. It's not going to work. So I don't just critique this and complain about it. I do have a proposal to make. And that is a concept that I started writing about in the book that I mentioned, and I'm now writing about mostly in the context of AI. Because I looked this up, I can say, yep, it would be important here as well, because the concept is to say we need some real technology as regulatory technology. So when I talk about AI, I talk about the fact we're going to need AI to help us regulate AI, and we need to recruit. So I agree with my economist colleagues here. We want diversity, we want innovation, we want lots of people laying a lot of bets. We want to attract investment and new ideas to this problem. We all want to be sitting around in rooms like this to talk about it, but I also want some smart people who are thinking, I've got a better way of making sure that the heavy duty vehicle emissions are hitting our targets. And I want government to set those targets. But I don't think I want 450 pages in the Federal Register in text as the method that we use for getting there. And that's the technology piece, regulatory technology, to say, I think we're going to need regulatory technology. So the concept of regulatory markets is to recruit this kind of investment, recruit this kind of participation by the private sector into inventing technologies, creating a sector of creating the emergence of a sector of independent, licensed private regulators, licensed on the basis of standards set by governments. So government, for example, can say, here are the emission standards, but saying to our targets of regulation, like the heavy duty, the operators of the heavy duty vehicle fleets, you must purchase the regulatory services of a licensed private regulator. And we could get diversity. Some might start out by saying, okay, I'll write down a bunch of words and I'll come and inspect, or I'll come and do pop tests. Others may say, I've got this machine learning system here, and I'm going to ask for you to send me your data. I'm going to be analyzing your data and identifying, and basically to allow that innovation in the regulatory technology. We spend a lot of time talking about who. So we've had that conversation about who governs. We've talked a lot about what we want and how we might decide what we want. We spend very little time on the how, and that's on us because we are developing this system. So I'm going to stop there and go to conversation.
Much, Jillian, to get us thinking about this AI-based almost regulatory system that people would buy into it. I have lots of questions are emerging, but before we go that, I guess I can exercise the privilege that I'm here and ask just a couple. Let me start with asking one question to each of you, and I'll start with Jillian and go backwards. AI modes of regulations probably would present the same issues that we tend to worry about AI often, which is it built with sufficient, is it biased? Is it well built? And where's the liability for this AI technology? So how do you get to accountability for your AI regulatory? And how do you evaluate whether indeed it is legitimate, democratic, free of bias, and so on?
And the insight here is that, and actually emissions control is a lovely example. You want to be saying, what are the outcomes that we want? So if we're going to be using machine learning based or AI based, and we will be, because it is going to transform absolutely everything that we do. It is like the electricity. And that was it. This is a very nice thing to think about, I think, at some point, not today. But it is going to transform everything. So it is going to involve AI, but we do need to regulate that. We need to regulate the provision of those services, and we need to be figuring out how to regulate on the outcomes. We do a lot of regulation right now on the inputs. This is how we regulate law. How do we know that we make sure that people are providing solid legal advice, dependable, reliable legal advice? We regulate the input. You got to go to law school. You have to pass the bar exam. You have to maintain, be a member of the law society. I want us to start checking the outputs and regulating the outputs. So if we're looking at, for example, one of the licensed regulators, and let's just stick with this emissions story here, would be, okay, my private regulators, I'm going to be evaluating their data, and I can test their AI systems on the outputs. Most of the time these days, I'm talking about developing these technologies to regulate AI. So it's for that purpose. And because I don't think that the current path we're down, which is very process-based, for example, the EU AI Act is, all about, well, we'll make sure you got the data in this way and you did these things, and but almost nothing about let's test the outputs. It's actually pretty easy for some of these things. Okay, I'm just going to run the test. Is it discriminating on the basis of race and gender? We can figure that out on the back end. I'd rather regulate on the back end and then open up on the front end for that. Yeah.
So what about you, Professor Niblett? The problems that we solved from 100 years ago using patents as the tools of progress, or tools of protection and innovation. Now, it feels like we don't have 100 years to solve the next one. So you moved away, and then you says, well, now we need more kind of government prizes, the new tools of reward as opposed to command and control. And that builds a little bit on what Ben has said as well. But how sophisticated are you in this imagination of the prizes? And we've been at it for quite a while. There's been research grants for a number of years. What's the next stage? Like if we're at the cliff and we need to be a little bit more pushing the envelope, we don't have 100 years to let the system percolate the right answer. What would you do?
What would I do? I don't have the answer. Let me be very clear. I don't have that answer. As I was, I haven't really thought about these problems before being invited to be part of this. And the more I thought about it, just the more I realized that the existing solution of property rights just doesn't get you there when we're thinking about the types of technology. If the problem is that you want to reduce the temperature, if that's the problem you're trying to solve, I don't think that property rights are the solution there. So that's a starting point. Then the question is, okay, so how do we do that? How do we do that? And there's a semi-robust literature on this question of how do we best incentivize where patents fail, and prizes have worked in the past. 1714, the British government really needed a way to determine the longitude of their ships. And rather than having a property right, what they said was they put out this prize of $20,000, which is the equivalent of $2-3 million now. What they did was they put that prize out there, and along came somebody pretty quickly, John Harrington or something like that, came along, this part-time scientist, and solved that problem, came up with a way to determine the longitude of a ship. Amazing. In around 1800, Napoleon needed a way to try and preserve food when he was at war. Didn't rely on property rights to just maybe someone will come along and solve this problem. Spurs the innovation, puts out there, how do we transport food efficiently, and how do we transport food so that my soldiers don't die? Somebody, Nicolas Appert, probably, came along and solved the problem and invented canned food. These are prizes that were put out there to solve a very particular problem. Part of the problem is that we as humans probably don't agree on what is the best solution, but what is the best, what is the problem that we need to be solving.
That goes to
yeah,
Ben's
which goes
point.
to Ben's. And so I think we should be trying to solve multiple problems. There are multiple problems out there. Which one will work? I have no idea. I've tried reading some of the scientific literature on this. I am not qualified to talk intelligently about the scientific literature on this. But all I know is, if you're looking for legal instruments to try and incentivize these types of technologies, I don't think our typical way of solving this problem will work. That what we need is something new. And I talk about prizes, that's for a finished, the finished product, but there are prizes all along the way, research grants designed to solve very particular problems. And private parties have tried to solve this too. Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Elon Musk, all sorts of people have put up a lot of money to solve particular problems. So it doesn't just have to be about the government. It can be private prizes as well.
So that answers some of the questions coming up.
Can I just
Jillian,
make-
you wanted to intervene
Yeah,
on
I
this.
just want, because I think we're missing the regulation drives innovation. So if you have outcome-based regulation, so how do we get automobile safety? Right? You have governments that say you've got X years to get fuel efficiency or safety down, accident rates to this level. And I think that's, so when the concept of regulatory markets is precisely driven by how do we secure that incentive to invest and attract money and brains to the challenge of how do we achieve those targets?
That gives you automobile safety, but
And fuel
but
efficiency.
does it get you the automobile? So that becomes the question. So there are different types of innovations that we want to incentivize, and the kinds of things that I was talking about is ones which are new, and where the
solution itself is not known.
Yeah, I mean, to some extent, and also the benefits are just so incredibly diffuse that the traditional ways of thinking about solving that problem may not work.
So what about you, Ben? Do you want to get into that debate? I mean, your idea about it seemed to me like ensuring that the winners reap their rewards provoked a few comments coming out here. How do you get to the problem of inequality and whether or not that's too much of a reward actually becomes compounding the sense of vulnerability that we've talked about in terms of who will suffer from climate change?
I spent a huge amount of my life thinking about tax law. And so I do realize that, and maybe this is part of the explanation, and it's an answer to this question. Winners win after tax dollars. They have to pay, they surrender a big chunk of the earnings associated with solving these problems in the form of taxes, right? And so, they're creating massive value. If you come up with a civilization saving technology, if you develop nuclear fusion and it's scalable and can be implemented very quickly, it can save us from our addiction, our civilizational addiction to fossil fuels, and solves petroleum-based transportation, heavy machinery, saves us from all the dirty electrical generation that we're doing around the world. If you come up with a technology that saves that, there are so hugely profound positive externalities associated with that innovation. I actually think the rewards are going to be really significant, and that may engender some resentment among people who are conditional with hindsight bias. Oh, you would have developed that if the rewards were a fraction of that. And so, but it's we want to incentivize as many bets as possible. And the way to do that is actually to commit to the winners actually reaping the rewards. That's how we're going to stimulate a really significant, one way of thinking about it is it's a bit of an immune response. How do we actually stir the innovation? And if we can't commit to having the awards, we may not get as much innovation as we hope to get. Now, something that Anthony mentioned, which is really interesting, is the Haber-Bosch process, right, for nitrogen fixation. That wasn't the result of an award. I don't think there was a prize. Was there a prize? They got a patent. Okay. Okay. And I wonder, patents might work. And so this is a question for you, actually. Do you think patents might be successful to protect nuclear fusion development? Is that enough of an award? Do we have to stipulate a prize? I don't know. And it could be that scientists are also motivated like the rest of us by fame and imagine saving civilization. That's a pretty good award too. And it's tough to deprive someone of that If they do actually save all of human civilization, they'll probably be remembered, and that might be a sufficient reward. Maybe we don't have to worry about economic incentives there as much.
Yeah, it would be wonderful if everybody was like Frederick Banting, and comes along and innovates in an incredible way that saves millions and millions of lives, and gets the reward, and then sells it for $1. That'd be amazing. It'd be, but we can't bank on people being like Frederick Banting. We just can't. We can't. That's not how we solve the problem. By hoping that people are going to be like Frederick Banting and solving the problem on their own from their own altruism. I don't think we can hope on that's.
So
needs to be that. Sorry, Nathalie.
No, let's continue on this one. And so there's a lot of good questions coming from the audience, obviously. First one, I think a little bit discussing technology development vis-a-vis the global South, and the role of pricing when the pricing, the reward actually makes people completely out of reach for poor people. Tech company survival is not a synonym with and sometimes is at odds with human survival of the global South. What do you think the law and policy could do to help out here? Is that a danger? It's not just inventing the solution, but is distributing it and ensuring equality and access to it? Is that a way to think about it? That's another problem.
I'll take to the extent to which it reflects on what I was talking about. I mean, the problem that I was talking about is that the benefits are so diffuse. And so if you're thinking about, and it's actually not a bad problem to have in this context, in the context of this question, because everybody benefits. Everybody benefits from it. The problem is trying to stimulate the activity to solve that problem when everybody benefits. And so that's the low-hanging fruit. I'll leave the higher hanging fruit for Ben.
Yeah. Gillian, there's a question for you here about isn't the international regulatory competition between different countries that have all committed to the legal objective of net zero by 2050 enough for innovation to occur in different countries? So basically and that's the question from Marcus Gehring here.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Marcus. Competition between states is not the same as competition between even nonprofit, but profit-oriented companies. And this is actually how I got into this whole business, was at some point thinking about, gosh, some of our areas of law, I was thinking just about contract law or corporate law. We don't have the kind of innovation you might expect in those legal domains. Why don't we? We've got a whole theory of regulatory competition in corporate law, in contract law, and yet what we observe there is very little diversification, very little differentiation and innovation. And I think that's coming from the fact that states operate under, it's just you just can't use the word competition and say states are competing for this, because look, all of us in this room populate the commissions and the committees and the political positions, so on, that then meet in the international settings and talk about what should we adopt. And law itself, the legal profession itself, even though individual lawyers compete, the legal profession itself does not compete against another provider of the end goal, which is how do you help people achieve their objectives, societies, and so on. So I think it's an important thing to think about, but no, I don't think it'll get us there.
Actually, there's a question from Gina Yingyong for you, Anthony, a little bit about, and I think you alluded that in your last comments, that it's not only government prizes, but also the private sector that can create the prize. And so her question is your optimism on government grants and prizes the same as it is for private businesses offering R&D grants and prizes, for example, the Amazon's Climate Pledge Fund, to other private businesses? What's your view?
I mean, I am optimistic. I don't know if if prizes will necessarily get us there, but I mean, originally it started off as quite a pessimistic paper, the idea that law as it is is actually quite impotent. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, actually, maybe there will be these other solutions popping up, these government prizes. They have worked in the past. Private prizes have worked in the past. Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic Ocean because of a private prize. It wasn't just, I want fame. He got $25,000 out of it. Private prizes sometimes do work to spur innovation. I think if there's a commitment from that sponsor, if there's a commitment to make that publicly available, like to make the knowledge publicly available, and they're not necessarily just going to, okay, now thank you for giving us that, we will hold on to that property right or something like that, then I think this is a good thing. We can sit here and debate that whether we think Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Elon Musk are doing a good job or not, but they've put money up to help solve some of these problems. Whether we think they're the right problems to solve or not is something that I'll leave to the experts. But people are putting up significant amounts of money to try and spur research to help solve these problems, and I think it's important. Well, I don't have a great answer to that question, so I apologize, but I am.
So let's actually, there's another questions for Ben here. Do you think that we need fusion regulation, or do you think that General Fusion decided to relocate its demonstrator to England from Vancouver because of the regulatory environment? So is there a way in which people are moving with their feet away from a regulatory environment, and is that a concern?
So this is a question that I am not qualified to answer, I think, but my initial reaction is, I think I'm thinking of the earlier exchange between Anthony and Gillian about regulation for safety. And I think at the research stages, when you're trying to get fusion developed, get it off the ground, I don't know how much regulation you want to have. You want to actually have freewheeling invention, and it costs a lot. I don't think the innovators are into destroying their equipment. They're gonna try to be careful with it. But once you have it in place, and if you're talking about scaling, absolutely, you want to make sure that those installations are safe and that you've deployed proper safeguards and redundant mechanisms to maintain the safety. I believe, based on my reading, that it is a pretty safe technology. So if it does malfunction, it just kind of like it cools down and it's relatively safe, and there aren't massive emissions. And so I don't think, it doesn't strike me based on my really superficial knowledge that safety regulation is going to be a huge problem for fusion.
But is it then, why would you relocate if indeed you are able to demonstrate that the risks are low? Just does that then translate about who is more risk adverse, or is that a question of culture of regulation as opposed to
I mean, the question surrounding a particular company making a particular choice, and I don't know.
So let's move on to another questions for Professor Niblett, or for all. Some research is being done on climate geoengineering, solar radiation management, particularly in certain countries in the global north. Would you agree that there's an urgent need for an international agreement on proceeding equitably to avoid unilateral use by one nation? It's from Reed Gomez.
No, so I've looked into some of the research that's been done, some of these scientific research that's been done. For example, at the Great Barrier Reef, there was years of buy-in to get everybody involved. So before we do anything here, we will get years of buy-in, and I think that's incredibly important. But then there's delay, and so I'm an economist, and I constantly come at these things from trade-offs. So there's a trade-off there of getting a buy-in from everybody. Now, some of these technologies that we're talking about, and there's sulfates in the atmosphere. It works best apparently if the sulfates are around the tropics, in the atmosphere around the tropics? Do we have to get buy-in from every country? I think probably that's pretty important if you're going to be, putting stuff in the atmosphere above those countries. I think that's incredibly important. But to get that buy-in, that might lead to additional delay. The stuff that's being done in Iceland on carbon capture, extraordinarily expensive, prohibitively expensive at the moment. Can it be rolled out globally? Where you've got those sorts of benefits, those sorts of technologies that do lead to, and I'm not sure what the potential costs, for example, where you're just thinking about carbon capture in that format, where you've got those benefits that are spread widely and costs, are not as great, then I don't think you need as much buy-in. So I think it's going to depend on the technology. Again, I'm no expert on the specifics, so I will defer to the experts on that. There is a potential trade-off. People have been working very carefully at the moment to ensure that people understand the benefits and the costs and the drawbacks so far. And one drawback is delay.
But isn't it one of the issue will be, so there are trade-offs, and some technologies will have to be regulated differently because the risks are different. And so somebody is going to have to make a decision there.
Yeah, and I think this goes back to Ed's and Michael's paper from yesterday. Yeah, somebody's going to have to be making those decisions. And this goes back to my very final comment, which is, law is we have these man-made countries that we drew some borders years ago. And then we decide that this is where law is. And so what we need is buy-in. We need international cooperation, because climate doesn't care about jurisdiction, just doesn't care. And so, yeah, do we need buy-in? I think it's going to depend on the particular technologies.
This is really interesting. Can I pick up a point here? Because it strikes me, Anthony, that you and Jillian disagree about something. Because Jillian seems to think what we need is state competition, or competition among regulators, and you're saying we need
private companies.
Well,
Yeah.
private regulators. We need regulatory competition somewhere.
Yeah.
Right. And Anthony, you're saying we need jurisdictions to cooperate with each other to harmonize. And I would have, like my own standpoint is actually we just need better law. We just need better regulation. I actually am agnostic as to where it comes from, or the mechanism by which it's delivered.
So I actually think this goes back to the automobile example that Jillian was talking about, which is when Jillian's thinking about this, she's thinking about innovations on the guardrails, innovations on the safety, innovations on how do we reduce the costs. And what I'm thinking about is innovations about the benefits, the creation of the technology. And so the question that came to me was, well, if we're going to be rolling out this and it's going to affect everybody, do we need to get buy-in? And that's where I think we need buy-in on two fronts. So I think what we need is international cooperation, in the sense of we can't be relying on particular countries to put up particular prizes, because the free rider problem, the benefits extend to more than just this country. My focus is totally on the benefits here. The benefits of this innovation are.
But why do you say the private sector is willing to put out some money, and why wouldn't a country not be willing? And there's a question about why would the international investment community care that a single government has given a prize?
Part of me, Ben and I were talking beforehand. I was like, why is it that they put up this money? Why do these private parties put up money? Why is it that so many people are investing in particular technologies? Now, I think there's a distinction between one's technologies where there could be a property right at the end of the day, and there are technologies where there is less likely to be a property right at the end of the day. And my question to Ben was, well, what is it that's driving this investment activity? And I'll let Ben give you his answer.
Well, I'm more interested in what Jillian has to say about this.
So there's who, there's what, and there's how. So I'm mostly talking about the how. even if you design a prize scheme, and if you say it needs to be an international one, you need a how for you're going to do that. And but I really want to make sure we don't skip away from the global South question about how we commit to and deliver on sharing benefits and burdens. That is a complex scheme that will require monitoring and testing and evaluating and, delivery, right? It's not enough to just write it down. So this is what worries me about how much time we spend saying, let's negotiate this incredible scheme, right? And then very little on, and how are we going to check to make sure that that's how the 400 pages there is mostly about how we're going to check on emissions. So if you're going to create a scheme, and I think we could be very creative, and it would be a global scheme for distributing. I was very sorry to have missed Mariana's talk this morning. I really, because at least intuitively, the idea of ensure resilience seemed to be the design of a scheme, which will need tons of legal structuring and delivery of that promise. Kim Stanley Robinson was talking yesterday about, loans and financing, and then we've got carbon capture credits or all this type of stuff. That is complex legal stuff that right now we rely on writing it down. And I want to say, okay, I want somebody investing some of that money, and here's how we can check. Here's how we can make sure that's actually, here's how we could, God forbid, put something on the blockchain. I don't know, it's energy consumptive, right? But maybe we invent different methods. But at any rate, innovative ideas about how we get there, because we all think we've done our job when we've left the fancy meeting in Geneva, right? And we've agreed. And it doesn't get us there. I started out, my very first class I taught in law school was women and work. And I was very interested, and we had pay equity legislation and Title VII, this is in the US. And basically the pay difference between men and women just hadn't budged much because it was mostly about occupational segregation, and none of that was addressed. So I've just been interested in this question of how much do we think our job is just to write something down
or measure whether it works or not.
And we don't do we. My
no.
question earlier, by the way, about can people point me to examples where things have been effective? Right? We don't want it to say I can point to legislation we've passed
No.
or court decisions that we've won. I want to say, point to me where the impact, and I think there is I mean, I lived for a while in LA, and I didn't live there at this time, but it used to be that LA was blanketed in brown haze for a good part of the year. That's not true anymore. That seems to me somehow there was an effective, the EPA did something effective. I want to know with respect to climate change, have we? That's what we need to be measuring and incentivizing. Okay, I'm done now.
Ben, you wanted to respond?
I thought originally I was going to disagree with you, Jillian, but I think I agree with you. And where my mind goes is to tax. I think in tax law, we don't have a problem of not enough complexity. We've written everything down. We have a couple different problems. One is, I think we actually haven't fully specified the tax system in enough detail, even though it's really, really extensive. And, the Income Tax Act or the Internal Revenue Code are documents that are perplexing in their length and in their content, and then the regulations clarifying what it all means, and then the rulings interpreting and applying. But it's still not enough. It's not nearly enough, because taxpayers are incredibly creative, and they will take that as a starting point, and then they will plan around those rules, those regulations. And so what we need actually is more law, and also more effective administration of that law. And so it requires both things, I think. And I will make no friends by saying we need more tax law, but we do need more tax law, and we need especially better administration of tax law. And I think that's a shortcoming. But I think I totally agree, because I think that's consistent also with what you're saying. And I don't necessarily need it to be written down. I don't think there's anything particularly moving about, publishing thicker and thicker versions of the Income Tax Act or the Internal Revenue Code. We need to operationalize the law in a way that actually makes it accessible. And allows it to influence behavior and makes it more administrable. And I think technology is a path to that.
Want to respond?
Well, I was going to say, I think where I would push there, because I do think I was going to say tax. So I'm saying if we're thinking about global distribution of benefits and burdens, right, that's a scheme. But I'd also say, how do you measure, like, what is your outcome variable with tax? Like, is there a way to set something in terms of an outcome variable and say, okay, and figure out other ways to get to that? Because we have invented systems where, the cost of compliance and the cost of adjudication and so on just swamps a lot of the benefits. And you would agree with that too.
Yeah, you with everything you're doing, you're probably not studying what's happening in international tax with the OECD and BEPS and Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And, there's a lot of efforts underway to establish a global minimum tax. There are questions about whether it's actually going to be successful, but there are a lot of people spending a lot of time trying to focus on that outcome variable that you're talking about.
There's a question here about the role of forum shopping in for tax reasons in the decisions of investing in technology or not, or companies, innovators moving from one jurisdiction to the next. Is that something that should be part of the analysis here?
What exactly is the question that people are?
The question was, regulation includes the fiscal regime. I can understand why there is forum shopping by innovators, even though, and that was going back to your fusion example, even though there's very little physical damage to the environment. So is that the differential, or, but it brought to me the idea that if we don't talk about tax, and I'm not one to end a Friday afternoon on this subject, but is that another failure, that the lack of integration of the tax regime here?
I don't think I have a strong intuition about where an innovation happens that will help mitigate the climate crisis. If it happens in one jurisdiction or another jurisdiction, I don't have a strong a priori reaction about where it should happen. So I don't think it doesn't influence my thinking.
Can I just, Gillian's last answer started off by saying, I think we gave short shrift to the global south question. And I totally agree, actually. I think, because of the way I was framing my view, which is focusing solely on the diffuse benefits, I mean, it completely neglects other solutions that are out there, which have a much more drastic effect on the global south and much more negative. Mm-hmm. Those numbers I was putting up earlier, they're averages. And it completely ignores the variance that some countries have benefited enormously in that last century, and some countries have not. Some countries have had 100% access to electricity for many years, and some countries like Chad have 8% access to electricity. And then some solutions, well, actually, let's try and mitigate it by reducing the amount of electricity, or something, because we produce electricity and it's harmful to the environment. And I think that's a terrible way of thinking about things. I think what we should be thinking about is, how do we get 100% in Chad. And mitigate the problem? And some of the solutions which are, more guardrails on the production, I don't necessarily think are the best solutions. That's why most of my mind, when I think about these things, goes towards the creation of the automobile rather than automobile safety. And that's just my own biases coming into the story. We have one question that I think you may want. Oh, there's a question from the audience. Yes, please. Yeah.
It's very helpful that all of you are talking about incentives to innovate, but you're looking more on the benefit side of it, or like the cash prizes. But what about the incentives to avoid risk? Like, I think one thing that we're all seeing here is climate risk is an absolute impending disaster. It's quantified in physical risk, so extreme weather events, as well as transition risks. So parts of our economy or assets becoming no longer valuable in 10, 20 years time. So how can that also be an incentive to this type of innovation that you're talking about? Because it's not necessarily a positive thing that you're trying to attain, but it's a very negative thing that you're trying to avoid.
It's interesting because in one of my questions that I had was the role of the insurance industry in supporting innovation. And I remember when the insurance industry decided that every ship had to have a little alarm. The person that had invented that alarm first became very rich, but the insurance decided to put a price on it. If you want insurance, you need to have that specific alarm that has just been newly invented. So, to avoid the destruction of
I mean, the reduction of risk is a benefit. You could think of technologies that reduce famine. Well, there's enormous risk and harm that's created from famine. We create technologies to try and reduce that. In the same way that some of the technologies that I was discussing in my talk, the geoengineering ones, they are the benefits that come out of that are the reduction of the risk. That is the benefit, the very benefit that we're talking about here. And not necessarily the mitigation of the current costs of production, but actually coming up with new solutions to fully address some of those risks that we're all concerned about, and actually saying, well, there is a catastrophic risk of if the temperature goes above 2 degrees above what it was. Okay, well then how do we think, and one potential solution is, how do we think about getting that number back down? How do we think about it? The benefit is the very reduction of the risk. And maybe I'm being too flippant in thinking about it like that.
Well, there's actually, go ahead, Ben, and then there's one important question I want to put to all of us, all of you that came from the.
I think embedded in that question is a suggestion to you, Anthony, about why are private parties supporting prizes for climate innovation, right? And who are the ones offering these prizes? They're extraordinarily wealthy billionaires who are saying, oh, I stand to have a lot to lose from the changes that are in the offing. And if I take a fraction of the wealth that I've, come into control of and put it up as a prize, I can perpetuate this into the future. And so I think there's a seed of an answer to that puzzle that you posed earlier.
Well, and that brings me to an interesting question here from Elise. How can we approach regulation to ensure that the powerful current technologies that stand to lose with decarbonization don't obstruct the growth of the new fabulous innovations that we've just been talking about, the new climate positive technologies that should replace them? Thoughts? Let's start with Jillian.
Oh, so now that is an appropriate who and what question, because I do think that is enormously difficult, and maybe it's something else that our expensive complex systems are also reinforcing. So if we think about who has access to expensive legal and litigation advice, lobbying efforts, who can draft the laws, who are in those rooms, like who's absorbing the 400 pages in the Federal Register. We have a system that makes it very difficult for us to address that question of how do we make sure that our system is not just protecting the existing. So I think this is so I started off by saying it's a who and a what, but it is also a how, but it's a consequence. I think it's an inequality consequence of the fact that we have invented a system where 90% of legal effort is devoted to corporate legal work.
Yes, your comments on this question?
Oh, I think it's a great question. I think I've been focusing solely on how do we create this incentive to actually innovate? And the next question is, well, once you've got that, how do you actually deploy this? How do we actually reap those benefits from a social perspective? And, I'm sure there's lots of examples out there of, of oil companies and car companies, not pushing forward with technology that was readily available, that could have benefited society. So how do we ensure that? I'm there. I have, you can imagine it's kind of like Frederick Banting holding on to it for 20 years and not releasing it, not just because he had some financial incentive not to release it. Okay, so that's where I think actually government prizes do a better job than patents. You look at the historical development of the steam engine. Nothing happened for about 20 years because James Watt was holding on to his patent and was just being brutal about this locking in the benefits, just like defending his patent. That didn't care about the social benefits whatsoever. It was only once the patent expired that we had this proliferation of innovation. And so I think that there's very negative things that sometimes come with patents. That's where one of the additional benefits of prizes, the government, if they fund these technologies, and they do come about, and, that knowledge is proliferated more broadly. And I think that's a kind of hopeful solution that, it's not being captured by these private interests who are trying to lock in their position rather than focusing on the social benefit.
Before going to Ben, I'm going to put a question to you about the ability of the public to tolerate the failures that, if government are putting up the money for the prizes, and presumably some of this are not going to be successful. So we'll have to, and the front page of the Globe and Mail will be that much money has been spent and sent to support this prize in something that went nowhere. How do we get there?
Yeah, there's different ways of thinking about those prizes. The classic prize is only if you succeed, you get the money. So that's the more politically palatable. That doesn't end up on the front page because the failures are all born privately. Where it's funding grants and we funded this $1 billion project to try and solve this and they got nowhere. Yeah,
That's science.
Yeah, that I think is when we fail, we learn. We do learn when we fail, and there will be we have to fail in certain projects in order to actually, because if we're not failing, then we're not trying enough, and we're not doing enough different projects. So we should be failing. We should be failing in some of these, and so how we make that palatable for the public, I have no idea. I'm the last person to ask, but I embrace the failure and the learning opportunities.
Ben.
So this is a question about dealing with losers. There's a book by our colleague, Michael Trebilcock, entitled Dealing with Losers. And it's a fantastic book. I recommend you buy Dealing with Losers. In addition to Picking Up the Slack, you should also buy Dealing with Losers. And Michael goes through a masterful cascade of different policy areas in which, dealing with, how do you deal with losers? How do you move things forward? I guess a couple thoughts for me on this, aside from invoking Trebilcock here. One is it really depends a lot on civil society to recognize the new technologies that are going to be very, very promising and engaging in counter lobbying. Like, we can't expect the incumbent interests, the legacy interests, to simply stand by and say, oh, you know what? That's way better than what we've got. The carbon foot, yeah, that beats us. And so we're just gonna, I guess we're out of business, and I guess everyone's out of a job here, and our share price is going to go to zero, and I guess we're done. That's totally implausible. That's not going to happen. So the question will be, well, what does happen? Well, you'd expect them to lobby, and there has to be political pressure brought to bear to figure out what to do next. And that's where I think conferences like this, having conversations, convening conversations, raising awareness is a really great idea. I think it also ties into having jurisdictions where you can see champions of particular technologies. And so it's naturally going to be the case where if a technology is coming from a particular jurisdiction, they're naturally going to champion the technology coming out of their jurisdiction and provide that example to be a beacon for others around the world to see how effective that technology is. And then it's up to the rest of us to notice those examples and pick them up and do our own counter lobbying for them in our domestic markets.
We're coming to the end of our time. I wanted to give you each the opportunity to just make final comments to our audience, before we let the conference end. Let's start with you, Jillian.
All right. So this is all a lot closer to the stuff I've been thinking about for many years than I thought. And because I want to end on the point of sort of looking at our young lawyers in the crowd here and say, it really is up to us, and it's going to require that kind of innovation in the way we do things. And we have to imagine law differently. We have to imagine what it is to do law differently. And that's on you.
So I mean, I will just reiterate, I came at this, generally I'm extraordinarily optimistic, and I came at this from a quite pessimistic position. And then I ended up coming back around to the optimistic position, because the more I think about historically how humans have solved problems, when we actually think about what life was like back in 1870 compared to what it's like today, and then you think about what life is going to be like in the year 2070, I'm actually extraordinarily hopeful. And I actually just want to say, thank you to those people who asked questions. I thought those questions were great and actually really got us thinking about some incredibly important questions that, I hadn't really been thinking of. So I really appreciate those questions. Thank you.
I'm going to close with an apology for starting off my talk talking about cutting down a tree at a climate change conference. It's like actually the most terrible way to start my talk. And so I've been sitting here the entire time thinking, I can't believe I did that, and nobody called me out on that, which is okay. Well, you're too subtle. So I'll call myself out on it and apologize to everybody for talking about cutting down a tree, because that's not. Yeah, exactly. Thanks, everybody.
We have to change the metaphors. Thank you.
So I have the happy task to say this was probably the perfect panel to have last, because there was lots of optimism, there was humor, there was back to the future and into the future, everything. So thank you, Nathalie, for moderating in the wonderful way that you did. Thanks, Ben, Anthony, and Jillian, and all of you genuinely for participating in the way you did throughout these yesterday and today. It's been really fantastic. It's kind of affirming for all of us who've been organizing this, because we thought very hard about how we make this different from just people sitting and giving papers, but actually trying to generate conversations. And I'd like to think that we've been able to do that. And I'm really happy and collectively very proud of what everybody has done here to make this happen. And I just want to end again by thanking all the many people who've been involved, but in particular, Andrew, Ben, Brenda, who've been part of the visioning team. And with that, I would invite you very warmly all to join us for a little more conversation, if you like. Optimism and humor. It doesn't even have to be about climate change. It could be about getting home before the snow comes, as you wish. Upstairs, we have a small reception. So thanks again for being here, and stay engaged, and you know where to find us.